You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today, I'm joined by Emile Chabal, a historian of 20th century European and intellectual life, and author of France, a book that delves into the paradoxes that define this country. He's here to discuss a word whose connotations vary widely across different countries and political structures. Républicain. Welcome, Emile, to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me here today. I am so excited to have you on, in large part because after reading your book, I've sort of started passing it around among my friends and fellow Francophiles because I think it's one of the most readable and yet really interesting, deep sort of analyses that I've read of French culture in a really long time. So I'm very excited to have you on today. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's a real pleasure. And it's wonderful to hear that my little book on France is making its way through the bookshelves and the tables of interested people, because that was the whole point of writing the book, was really to introduce people to France, but also introduce them to some of the really complicated historical and sociological and political questions that dominate contemporary French public life. So if your friends are learning from it, then that makes me particularly happy.
Absolutely. And I'm really excited that we're here to discuss, I think, the biggest false friends that I see in terms of sort of, we're talking about a socio-political context in France, which is this word, especially as an American, that means two very different things: Republican and Républicain. And you delve into this from a number of different angles. I love how contemporary you get in this book, because I think we have a tendency to look at France almost as though it's kind of halted in the past, especially when it comes to, the French Revolution and the effects that we feel of, these constant revolutions through the late 18th and 19th centuries in France today. So before we delve too deep into the politics, because I know we're going to talk a lot about that, could you just right off the bat tell me a little bit about why Republican and potentially big R Republican is a poor translation of the French term républicain? What is the difference between those two words for you?
Well, I think this has a lot to do with what you described as a socio-political context, right? The word Republican is, in fact, a perfectly accurate translation of the French Républicain. It works. The problem is that in English, and particularly in the American context, Republican has come to be associated very strongly with the Republican Party and with Republican politics. And so that has changed the meaning of the word, or rather not so much changed, but perhaps added very, important layers to the meaning of the word in English. But the sort of origin of this term, right, Republican, and what is Republican about? In English, it's about republic. So it's about the idea of a republic and what a republic looks like. Now, of course, there are many different republics, so that's already something we could delve into in a little more detail. Even in English, the word republic can mean a lot of different things. But at its core, Republican in English has the same meaning as Republican in French. The difference is the journey of this word through the modern history of France. And in the case of France, républicain has become freighted with meaning, and that meaning is attached to, as you mentioned earlier, the French Revolution and other revolutionary moments in modern French history. And so it's taken on a whole different set of connotations in France to the connotations it has certainly in the US and even elsewhere in the English-speaking world. So it's really to do with the history surrounding the word rather than the word itself.
So I love the way that you described this as revolutionary moments. And I think this is a really apt moment for us to kind of explore the French political structure that is the Republic, because currently in France in 2024, we are on the fifth Republic. So just from for anyone who isn't familiar with the way that happened or why we are on our fifth Republic, can you kind of explain how we got to be where we are today in as Cliff Notes away as you can. For those who want to know a lot more, you delve very, very well into this in your book, but just as a surface level.
Of course, very happy to do that. I think that the first thing to say is that in French, Républicain and République refer to two different things which are often conflated. One is a set of institutional and political structures, and the other is values. And so when you talk about First Republic, Second Republic, Third Republic, Fourth Republic, Fifth Republic, what you're really talking about is institutional and political structures. That is the way the state and government is organized in France. We might later come on to what Republican values might be, because that's really important in the contemporary debate. But in terms of institutional and political structures, you are absolutely correct. France is in its fifth republic. And the fact that it's in its fifth republic should really be a reminder that the history of republicanism in France has been very, very contested since the French Revolution. So the first republic is born in 1792, as an outcome of the first stage of the revolution. And so the revolutionaries proclaim a republic. This republic does not have a monarchy, so that's one of its crucial aspects. And particularly important in the French context is that in the First Republic, the revolutionaries derive their power and legitimacy from the people, right? So the French Revolution takes the lessons of the American Revolution one step further in terms of investing sovereignty in the people. So republicanism in the French Revolution is about getting rid of the monarchy and about giving power to the people in a very simplistic way. I mean, it's more complicated than that, but that's the easiest way, perhaps, to grasp what's going on. And the First Republic is basically terminated in 1804 when Napoleon declares himself as an emperor and then goes on to rule until his defeat in 1815. And France does not have another republic then until the Revolution of 1848, when the Second Republic is inaugurated as a result of the revolutionary wave that takes off in the first few months of 1848. And those revolutionaries and that revolution is inspired by the principles and the ideas and the memory of the French Revolution, the First Revolution. But that republic is also short-lived. It only lasts for a few years. And in 1851, Napoleon III, as he becomes known, again declares himself emperor and again terminates the Republican project. It's only in 1870 that we start to see the emergence of what you might call a long-term republic. And so the 1870 is the moment of the inauguration of the Third Republic, the end of Napoleon III's rule, the end of the Second Empire, which was what we call the period that when Napoleon III governed. And from 1870 all the way through until 1940, so the fall of France, when France is defeated by Hitler and Nazi Germany out the outbreak of the Second World War, from 1870 to 1950, the system of government for that entire period is the Third Republic, and it's a parliamentary democracy. And it's a parliamentary democracy that goes through many phases, of course, because there are a lot of historical events that happened between 1870 and 1940, not least the Paris Commune in 1871, the First World War from 1914 to 18, and of course, the rise of fascism from the 1920s to late 1920s onwards in Europe. Come the Second World War, France is defeated, the northern part of France is occupied and directly governed by the Germans, and the southern part of France is governed by the Vichy regime, the so-called Vichy regime, which is a collaborationist regime. So that's the end of the Republic. This is obviously the end of all of the principles and values and ideals of the Third Republic. But when the war ends, when France is liberated, de Gaulle is, of course, Charles de Gaulle is a major figure at that moment. But when he comes back, partly because of France's experience during the war, when he comes back to France, he's very committed to the idea of restoring parliamentary democracy in some form or another. And so even though his power as a kind of leader doesn't continue very long after the liberation of France in 1944. There are other political forces. The establishment of the Fourth Republic seems to be a way of getting past the calamity and catastrophe of the Second World War, when France was obviously occupied and defeated. So that's inaugurates the Fourth Republic is inaugurated in 1946 with a set of new elections, and the Fourth Republic continues until 1958. What's happening in 1958? Well, the war in Algeria is happening in 1958. De Gaulle returns to politics after a long time in the wilderness, as it were, and he comes back and he takes control of the French government in a time of crisis, and he says the only way that we can move beyond the disaster that is the Algerian War is by rewriting the constitution and inaugurating a fifth republic. So the Fifth Republic is born in 1958, and the Fifth Republic departs a little bit from the Third and Fourth Republic by its presidential structure. And so de Gaulle and those who write the constitution emphasize the importance of a strong executive authority, and actually, comparatively, French presidents have more power on paper than almost any other president in the world. They have a great deal of both political and military power, far more, for instance, than the US president. So the Fifth Republic, which is what the system of government that still exists in France now, is a parliamentary democracy, but with a very strong executive authority in the form of the president. And that makes it a little different, as I said, to previous republics, which were by their nature non or anti-authoritarian and tended towards parliamentary government as preferable to executive rule. And you can understand why, given that France had been under authoritarian rule for large chunks of the 19th century. The Fifth Republic is essentially the kind of structure of the French state and the structure of French government. And it hasn't changed a great deal in formal terms since 1958. But one thing that is important to mention is that there has been a great deal of decentralization since the 1980s. And that has involved devolving powers to regions in France, which has somewhat undercut the kind of authoritarian model of the Fifth Republic. But basically, the Fifth Republic is more or less unchanged. And that's why many politicians now in France, particularly on the left, argue for a Sixth Republic, for a new constitutional settlement that will move beyond the very president-heavy model that exists right now. Amazing.
Okay, so that was, the most complete. I'm in awe that you were able to recount so much history so shortly and so quickly and so deftly. And one thing I definitely want to come back to that you touched upon while you were speaking is this idea that obviously republic is a political structure, but it's also a set of values. And you were speaking, about the left and the right, and obviously about this role that Charles de Gaulle played in kind of uniting the left and the right under this idea of the republic. Can you speak a little bit to the ways in which the left or the right might feel about this central idea of the governing principles of a republic, and whether the values that a republic embodies are more within the purview of the left or the right over time? I'm not sure if that's something that evolves quite a bit in our idea of the republic.
Absolutely, yes. Really good question. Yeah, I hope my historical flybys are not too embarrassing to my colleagues who really know about the 19th century and the early 20th century in a way that I don't. I'm always trying to synthesize pretty complicated processes. So
I think that's part of the gig, right? Is to, everything we want to say, there's so many layers and so much complexity. Obviously, anything that we talk about, there's someone who's an expert in that particular element. So it's one of the hazards of the job, I suppose.
Absolutely. And especially if you're talking about Républicain or République, you are really having to take on 250 years of French history, if not more. And it's very difficult to avoid that. So you're absolutely right.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Storytime in Paris, where each week host Jennifer interviews a different author. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French.
In terms of left and right, this is a relatively simple question to answer, actually. Until the 1960s, references to La République and Républicain were overwhelmingly associated with the left in France. And this goes all the way back to the French Revolution. So in this case, there's a real sort of historical legacy here. And what the French Revolution does is it sets, in a sense, the political parameters of French politics for the next 150 years. So if you are on the left, traditionally, as I say, until about the 1960s, you are in favor of the revolution. you believe in what the French Revolution represented, and you believe in its values, and you believe in the progressive and revolutionary transformative potential of the revolution. If you're on the right, you don't like the revolution. And so that varies from disliking it, but sort of tolerating some of its legacies, to, at the most extreme end, thinking that the revolution was a great godless sin that brought terror and violence onto France. So the extreme right, particularly the Catholic extreme right, believed that for a very long time. And in between, you have what you might call French liberals or French centrists who so want to take the good bits of the revolution, but don't want all the nasty violence and disagreement and schisms and divisions that came with it. So in the 19th century, if you say you're Republican, it's almost certainly because you believe in the values of the revolution. And you think that what the revolution tried to achieve in terms of sovereignty of the people, in terms of opposition to authoritarian or monarchical rule, in terms of rational political structures that would give one person one vote or one man one vote in the 19th century, since women were not able to vote. If you believed in those principles, you were de facto on the left. And so to say, in the 19th century, anybody who said they were Républicain or they believed in the République, they were announcing their left-wing credentials. And exactly the same was true on the other side of the political spectrum. If you're on the right, you almost certainly denounced the Republic or Republican. And if you were in the middle, you would sort of try and see both sides and try and make both sides work. But that was quite difficult because the French Revolution polarized politics for the next 150 years. So it was quite difficult to be in the middle. Now, what happens after the Second World War, and I think this is quite important, is that the Second World War really damages the far right. And it damages the far right because, of course, fascism is defeated, not just militarily, but fascism is also defeated ideologically. And so across Europe, you have what you might call an anti-fascist consensus. That is, fascism caused the Second World War, therefore fascism is bad. And so even conservatives and even right-wing politicians and political leaders found it very difficult after the Second World War to be opposed to Republican values in an explicit way, because that's exactly what the far right were before the Second World War. They were opposed to the Republic, and ultimately in France, the Republic collapsed in 1940. And so to be opposed to the Republic is, in the 1950s or 1960s, essentially to be opposed to the governing system of France. And so from the end of the Second World War until about the 1960s, what you see is gradually more and more right-wing politicians, and indeed in some cases right-wing thinkers, relax about what it means to be Republican. And they are not going to go and announce that they are Republicans, and they're not going to celebrate Republican values because that's still very much the purview of the left, but they are no longer going to oppose them as they might have done in the 1820s or in the 1880s or in the 1930s. They're not going to oppose that. And what de Gaulle does, I think, and this is really interesting, so by reformulating the Constitution in 1958 and inaugurating this Fifth Republic, what de Gaulle does is he says, you know what, we on the right, de Gaulle, very much a man of the right, comes out of a conservative tradition, born in a conservative Catholic family. What he says is we on the right, we have our own vision of the Republic. And de Gaulle was always by himself, so it's kind of, that vision is my vision. So de Gaulle allows a large swathe of the French right to reconcile themselves to the Republic in the form of the Fifth Republic, leaving only angry far-right activists who are still angry about the decolonization of Algeria and still angry about communism and about the left as the sort of the extreme critics of republicanism. So in terms of your initial question about left and right, the answer is very simple. Until the 1960s, we're essentially talking about an idea and a set of values and a set of institutions that are very strongly associated with the left. That, since the 1960s, that's changed. And now, in 2024, we are in a very strange situation for a French historian of hearing and seeing right-wing and indeed in some cases far-right politicians invoke la République and le modèle républicain and les valeurs républicaines. And in some cases saying that actually they are the true guardians of those values. And the left has reneged on those values. So in the last half century, there's been not a total transformation, but there's been a total co-option of républicain by the right for its own purposes.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is something you can see quite clearly, for example, in the name of the party Les Républicains, to which Nicolas Sarkozy belongs. We see this sort of shift, maybe away from what you were describing as this sort of revolutionary, quite leftist mindset, but we're still seeing on either side this evocation of values, which I think is a word that we see in politics a little bit more in France than I personally see on the American side of things. I'm not sure in the UK if politicians are quite so quick to evoke values or, this actual term. And I think, one thing that you evoke at several points in your book are these values and an evolution in these values, some of which remain quite fixed and some of which change over time. If you had to sort of define those values today, what do you think the contemporary Republican values that we're talking about, whether we're on the left or the right, are in France?
Well, I sort of say in my book, right, that there are a set of core values that are associated with French republicanism, and I think it's worth listing those very briefly, and then maybe talk about how the left and the right in the contemporary moment have taken from different bits, if you like, of those, of that recipe, that core recipe for republicanism. So what might be a fairly uncontroversial list of Republican values? Well, we would first want to mention, as I've already mentioned, in fact, an opposition to monarchy and a suspicion of executive authority. That's part of the DNA of French republicanism in a way that even in the US, the grand Republican tradition doesn't have that same suspicion. It's spawn of the experience of the 19th century in France, those periods of authoritarian rule. The other thing which is central to republicanism and remains that way is representative government. So some form of representative government, ideally parliamentary government, but not necessarily. Another key value is a robust conception of citizenship and civic participation, right? So French republicanism, its key characteristics is the demands it places on French citizens to be active citizens and to conform to a project of collective citizenship. And that you see to some extent in the United States as well, but it's framed very differently. And in Europe, there are very few other places which have such a strong sense of civic citizenship. Another element of French republicanism, which is very important, is a commitment to rationality and the rule of law. But the rule of law here doesn't mean, as it does, let's say, in the American system, the primacy of the courts. It means the primacy of the legislative body, that is Parliament, in making laws. So this is a really significant difference in the US and France, which are both on paper republics, is that Parliament is sovereign in France, and Parliament makes a lot of the laws that in the US end up going through the court system and sometimes ending up in the Supreme Court, right? So there is no equivalent to the judicial branch of the American political system in France. The power lies with Parliament. And that's why parliamentary legislation is so controversial and complicated in France, because that is where many, many laws are being created, as it were, and Parliament has the final say. Lastly, the thing that we should talk about, something we might come back to, is that republicanism in France, and again, very strong difference with the US, implies some form of secularism, which is often wrapped up in a strongly anti-clerical discourse. And this, again, is tied to the omnipresence of the Catholic Church in modern French and even early modern French history, and the institutional, ideological power of the Catholic Church. And one of the things that has united Republicans really since the 1790s all the way through to the 21st century is a commitment to reduce and minimize the power and presence of religion, particularly in the public sphere. So those are, if you like, that's a kind of list of values, and I'm trying to be as uncontroversial here as possible. Now, then the left and the right have done different things with those values. So to pick the example of the last thing I was talking about, which is secularism, what the French call laïcité. In the 21st century, there's a lot of talk about laïcité. Laïcité has been one of the big public debates in France in the last, I'd say, 30 years or so. And the left and the right have a different conception of what laïcité actually means and what lies behind it. But there is enough common ground that very often the left and the right, or members of the left and the right, or those who advocate left or right-wing positions, end up on the same side of a particular debate. So you can see on the one hand that, for instance, for the right, secularism is a good way of talking about the presence of Muslims and the presence of Islam more broadly as a religion in French society. And the French right is profoundly opposed in an ideological sense to the presence of Islam. There are a good number of politicians and thinkers and intellectuals on the right who might fairly be described as more or less racist or Islamophobic, to use a slightly more controversial term. But rather than talk about Islam directly, they can draw on this Republican tradition of secularism to say, you know what, we're not actually racist. We are simply defending France's Republican values against the threat of Islam and the threat of this religion, what they see as a threat of this religion in the public sphere. People on the left in France believe, usually, for the most part, actually believe also that the religion should be as much as possible evacuated from the public sphere. But for their own reasons, they are wary of talking about this too much now in the 21st century because they're scared of sounding too much like they are opposed to Muslims specifically, or that they have some vendetta against Islam. So what's happened in the last 20, 30 years is that actually laïcité, which used to be a really core value of the French left, because it was all about reducing the power of the Catholic Church, has ended up being co-opted increasingly by the right and indeed the far right. And so you have a sort of shift where the people on the left are saying, we still believe in laïcité, but our laïcité is different to their laïcité. And of course, that level of complexity is often inaudible in the public space. What you actually end up hearing is right-wing politicians saying we need more laïcité because we want to stop women wearing the hijab, or we want to stop women bathing in pools in modest dress, or we want to limit the number of mosques in a particular neighborhood or town and so on. So that's how you kind of see these set of values can get used and manipulated in different contexts by different political groups.
Absolutely. And anyone who's interested in learning even more about the laïcité question should definitely check out the episode we did in the first season with Lindsay Tremuta. I'll put a link to that in the show notes because it's such a complex issue that we're talking about more and more today for all of the reasons that you just cited.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Paris: A State of Mind, where real estate experts Gail and Marie give you all the tips and tricks you need about renting and buying apartments in Paris and beyond. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French.
Another one of the values that you mention in your book that I found quite interesting, and I would love to kind of unpack with you, is the Republican, and I quote, hostility to intermediary bodies. So could you tell us a little bit more about sort of where this comes from and how it's felt on the French landscape today?
For sure. I actually think this is a really useful topic to think about for outsiders, particularly from the English-speaking world, because it runs counter to the way there's kind of dominant political values certainly in the UK and in the US as well. So suspicion of intermediary bodies, this probably sounds very abstract, right? It sounds like we're talking about political theory, but what does this mean? Well, again, as with so many other things, the origins of this fear go back to the French Revolution. And to simplify radically the sort of extraordinarily complex revolutionary moment, many of those who were advocates of the revolution believed that the relationship between the state and government and citizens should be a direct and unmediated relationship. That is, that individual citizens should have an individual relationship with the state, or with the state and government in this case are kind of conflated. And so this has the idea of this sort of individualized citizenships has long roots in Enlightenment and early modern political thought, which we don't need to go into. But the French Revolution goes further than any other revolution in the 18th century in terms of trying to implement this. So in the American Revolution, the primacy of states remains a central plank of the revolutionaries. So in a sense, they accept the primacy of individual states within the broader republican system that emerges out of the War of Independence, right? But in France, there are no such intermediary bodies, because all such intermediary bodies pose a threat to the revolution as it's developing. And the obvious example of this, and I mentioned this earlier, is the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church in the late 18th century is an extremely powerful institution that acts and that could act like an intermediary body to, in a sense, siphon away the allegiance of individual citizens from their state. So rather than being French above all and French citizens, the revolutionaries are scared that the Catholic Church will, in a sense, undercut the influence of the revolution. The institutional and ideological power of the church will take away what the revolutionaries are trying to create, which is a nation in which all citizens are equal and they all have this equal and individual relationship to the state. So the question of religion looms really large for French revolutionaries in the late 18th century, and they deal with it in a whole variety of ways. They also address minority religions, particularly Judaism, and what relationship Jews should have to France. And there's a very famous debate in the French National Assembly in which, the revolutionaries essentially decide that everything can be given to Jews as French people, but they can be given nothing as Jews, right? So they will be emancipated and they will have equal rights, but they will have those equal rights as French citizens, not as Jews. So this anxiety about the power of intermediary bodies is born in the French Revolution. And of course, the 19th century doesn't do much to dispel this fear, right? Because the Catholic Church comes back to prominence during periods of authoritarian rule. And so when the Third Republic is inaugurated in 1870, those who call themselves Republicans are very wary of any organization or any group that might mediate or get in the way of, or even try to represent citizens that doesn't involve this direct relationship with the state. Now, again, it sounded very abstract, but let me bring it into the very contemporary moment and give you a really good example of one of the consequences of this. You and your listeners may have noticed that French political parties are very weak. They fall apart. They change their name all the time. None of them are, with the exception of the French Communist Party, more than 50 years old. There is nothing like the Labour Party and the Conservative Party in the UK or the Democrats and the Republicans in the US that have very long histories. None of that. Why is this? Well, that's because within the structure of all of the French republics and even the Fifth Republic, political parties are seen to be a potential intermediary body between citizens and the state. And therefore, political parties have never really been very well developed, except in the case of the French Communist Party, which drew on a whole different tradition on the left. But all political parties in France are subject to renegotiation because the structures of those political parties are weak and have been weak for a very long time. Another good example of this is the trade union movement in France. So this is a real contrast with, let's say, Germany or the UK, where in the mid to late 19th century, the trade union movement becomes a really important part of politics in those countries. In the case of the UK, the trade union movement supports the emerging Labour Party and becomes, more or less a party unto itself. In France, trade unions are not recognized until the 1880s, much later than in other parts of Europe. And trade unions remain really quite weak. We can come back to this later because your listeners might think, French are always on strike, and so, the trade unions must be strong. But actually, trade unions are not strong in France, and they represent a relatively small proportion of the workforce. And again, the problem for trade unionists has always been that they are viewed with suspicion by governments or by presidents because they are in some senses intermediary bodies that seek to represent a particular group of the population on their behalf. So this sphere of intermediary bodies has really, really important consequences. It sounds very abstract, but it has incredibly important consequences for the way French politics works. And it's totally different to somewhere like the US, where, on the contrary, the notion of civil society is absolutely central to the way that American politics functions, from the role of churches to the role of labor unions to the role of political parties, all of which, in a sense, mediate and manage the representation of specific political groups in American society. All of those structures kind of exist in France, but they are much weaker. And so the state and government and parliament is much stronger and has much greater authority in France than certainly in the US.
And I wonder if that's something where what you touched on earlier about the changes in the late 80s to the way the Republic functions in France, is there a link to that, to the sort of dissemination of more power on a regional sphere? Or does that run counter to your mind to the way that Republican values have been championed over the course of the last, over 100 years?
Yeah, I think it does. And I think many, actually, if you step back from some of the polemics and the controversies around the word Républicain, République in the 21st century, in the last 20, 25 years, a lot of them have to do with, shall we say, the gap between the way things are done locally and the message that's coming down from the top. The top could be the Ministry of the Interior, the top could be the President, the top could be the préfet, who are the kind of representatives of the state at the local level. But all those people have particular agendas that are governed very often by an interpretation of the Republic as a unified, indivisible political entity. And then local actors who are just trying to kind of solve particular problems that are taking place. So a really good example of this is in the late 1980s. A polemic emerges around the decision on the part of a head teacher in a school in the outskirts of Paris to ban or to suspend a group of female students wearing the hijab, the headscarf. And the head teacher decides on this, and the head teacher says, I'm doing this in the name of Republican values because the French public school is and should be a neutral, non-religious space, and I consider the hijab to be a sign of religious affiliation, and therefore I am suspending these students on the grounds that they are not conforming to the rules. So there's a long history of this, and I'm sure you covered it in your segment on laïcité. But what's interesting is that was a local decision made by one head teacher. Other head teachers who'd faced similar problems made different decisions. And what happened was that this particular decision on the part of this particular head teacher became very politicized. And at this point, the government of the time had to respond and had to try and find some sort of solution to this problem. And for many years tried not to legislate and provide a kind of firm directing line on this issue, allowing a lot of leeway to schools. Until the early 2000s when, in 2004, finally the French Parliament voted a law that prohibited ostentatious religious symbols, what they called ostentatious religious symbols in public schools. And that has kind of now, since then, has set the parameters for this debate where there is now a law. And so then it's a question of schools at a local level trying to work out what that law means and how to implement it. But that's a really good example, I think, of what you were talking about, which is the problems when this very abstract idea of French republicanism, of les valeurs républicaines in French, comes into contact with the everyday messy realities of administering a school or administering a neighborhood or managing particular social conflicts and so on.
Mm-hmm. And we've touched on so many great topics. I'm sorry that I can't keep you here for another hour, but I'm going to ask you one last question. And I know that you're not in the business of predicting the future, but as you've sort of examined the evolution of this idea of republic and Republican values and sort of watched this shift occur from left to right in sort of who is laying claim to these values, do you have any idea or any expectations regarding how these values are going to continue to be espoused and sort of venerated by the French moving forward as sort of society continues to evolve?
That's a very good question. Historians traditionally make really bad predictors of the future. We find the past so complicated that we can barely get our head around the future. I think that actually here we're at a quite interesting critical juncture. And I say that because on the one hand, France is both institutionally and in terms of its values, a profoundly republican society, more than it has ever been, I think, since the French Revolution, right? So really until the 1960s, a lot of people in France simply didn't believe in the idea of la République and les valeurs républicaines. There were huge swathes of the electorate, particularly on the right, who just thought this was all left-wing claptrap and nonsense. And so, until the 1960s, no one could say that republicanism as a set of values was dominant in French society. Since then, and since the inauguration of the Fifth Republic, I think most people would agree, certainly most historians would agree, that we've entered a kind of golden age of republicanism. But, of course, what comes with ubiquity is also contestation, right? So as France has become more and more of a republican society in its organization and its values, more and more people in France have begun to fight about those values and about those principles. And I think we've reached a stage now where there are a number of really glaring issues that refuse to go away, and certainly haven't gone away in the time that I've been working on France, so 20 plus years now. One has to do with the question of difference and how the French are going to try and conceptualize the reality of very self-consciously multi-ethnic and diverse societies, how they're going to reconcile that with the very unitary, top-down values that are implicit or explicit in French republicanism. And the other thing, so that's on the value side. The other thing is on the institutional side, there is a growing criticism of the institutional structures of the Fifth Republic, and particularly of its heavy presidentialism. The French are more and more skeptical of the single male figure who will dominate French politics. So there are calls which have come and gone at different points for a kind of change in the institutional regime. One example of that is introducing proportional representation into or back into French elections. So having elections that would be based much more strictly on the number of votes cast, rather than, as is the case right now, elections that are mostly on a kind of two-round system where a certain number of candidates are eliminated, and then there's usually a runoff between two or more candidates in the second round. Both the criticism of the values of French republicanism and the institution of French republicanism could have some quite serious consequences in years to come, especially, I think, if the French left, who are traditionally the guardians of French republicanism, turn their back on it and say, you know what, this is no longer, this is just now, it's just become a tool for the right to say whatever they want, and actually we have other ideas. So it's possible that there could be the emergence of some kind of very strong contestation of the kind of core institutional or political values of French republicanism. Having said that, it's really difficult to imagine that France's whole political system will change overnight. If you've ever been into a mairie in France, if you've ever talked to a local politician or local councillor, or if you've ever had anything to do with the French state or with French schools, or you will know that the values of republicanism, which are now supported by these really powerful institutions and indeed by the state itself, are embedded in everyday life in France. And so the idea that suddenly all of this might be tossed to one side and there might be some new vision of secularism or some new vision of how intermediary bodies function in France, that seems really unlikely to me. So it's a kind of mixed bag. I think that there might be significant change coming up, but I don't think we're going to see the end of La République or of les valeurs républicaines anytime soon.
Amazing. Well, thank you so very much for joining me today. It has been illuminating. I'm going to share a link to this book we keep referencing in the show notes. I highly recommend anybody who's interested in French culture, politics, society, pick it up. Is there anything else that you're working on right now that you're excited about right now? What is your current sort of focus, and where can people find more of your writing?
Well, the best place to find more of my writing is on my website, where I have more or less collated everything I've written. So on a variety of different issues, not just on France. So that's the easiest one-stop shop. There are two projects which I might mention. The first is a book which just came out on the governing of irregular migration in Western Europe since the end of the Second World War. And it's a collaborative book project where a team of us worked on this really, really interesting question of how European states deal and have dealt with what's often known as illegal migration. Because, of course, something that's illegal, something that's irregular is by definition invisible or shouldn't be visible. And yet states have still had to try and deal with this in really interesting ways. And so the book which came out of it, which is full of really interesting chapters about different episodes in the history of migration in Germany, in France, and the UK. One of the big lessons is that, believe it or not, irregular or illegal migration was not really an issue until the 1960s and 1970s. And so one of the biggest topics in contemporary European politics, which is illegal migration, was really a non-issue not that long ago. And I think how it's become an issue is fascinating. So that's the first thing I want to mention. The second thing is that I'm writing, and this is what I'm doing right now, is I'm writing a big intellectual biography of the Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, who many people know as somebody who wrote lots of textbooks that students are made to read in college or university. And that's been really, really interesting. But the book of that is not out yet. So I'm just finishing that. And hopefully it'll be out in the next few years.
Amazing. Well, we look forward to the release of that, and I'll be sure and put a link to your website and to your new book in the show notes as well. So anybody who's interested in reading more on those topics should definitely take a look. Thank you so very much for joining me. I've really appreciated all of your insight, and I'm sure our listeners have as well. Thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.